Hello, Brubs. We're back with the After Midnight Ghost book, which so far has not been good. Like that song goes. It has not been good. But let's continue. We're on to an actual story that is called Ghost Story. James Aldridge, the Black Ghost of St. Helen. Let's see if I can get this thing in control. The Black Ghost of St. Helen, a small country town in Victoria, Australia, was given to the town by my father in a court of law, and though the original case in which he was the defense lawyer was tried over 40 years ago, I heard only the other day that the ghost was still active in the town, still being seen and still frightening those who wanted to be frightened, or thrilling those who wanted to be thrilled. Given my father's short temper and his unceasing intention as an Englishman to show Australians where they were going wrong, I suppose the end result of the case was bound to be the exposure of a spiritual sideslip in the town's easy callousness towards one of its true indigenies. In any case, it was inevitable that my father should appear for the defense when the issue came to law, because no one else was fool enough, or maybe arrogant or English enough, to think that he could defend what was obviously a straightforward case of murder, even though the prosecution couldn't produce a body. It didn't matter, because the one qualification my father always looked for in a case was its inner logic. Once he had found this inner logic, he was always able, with his own legal logic, to build a stirring defense for his client, which was usually very difficult for the prosecution to disrupt. In the case of the Black Ghost of St. Helen, his use of its inner logic was particularly satisfying to him, because it gave him a chance to teach the town a lesson, not only about its spiritual failings, but also the very nature of being Australian, which was really the one passion of his English legal struggles with the town. But enough of this anticipation, and enough of my father for the time being. I shall tell the story as it happened in its own sequence, which means that I must start with Bob. Yeah, that's me. I must start with Bob. Bob was our local aborigine, Bob the Blackfeller, and he worked as a stockman for Gil Sullivan, one of 4 local horse breeders and stock drovers. Together, Gil and Bob were a popular pair, not a peculiar one. Not only because they were wonderful horsemen, but because they were both quiet and gentle types, who yet managed, as drovers, some of the biggest herds of beef that were ever driven into the town stockyards. Bob was particularly popular because he was a smiling, obliging man who didn't mind digging a patch of garden or carrying a load for someone simply as a favor, which was a real concession from a stockman, even though he was an aborigine. In fact, Bob was a colorful figure in his white doeskin jodhpurs, ankle boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. It was the uniform, then, of all black stockmen. Bob also carried a stock whip, and his prowess with it was well known. He could safely flick a cigarette from Gil Sullivan's mouth at 10 yards and crack the whip loudly at the same time. When he and Gil were not droving cattle into the town from one of the surrounding stations, Bob looked after Gil's thoroughbreds and lived in a little hut to one side of the stables. It always smelled of horse manure when we visited him, but Bob was happy with it. Good air, he would say, and sniff deep of the horse. In summer, Bob would often join us, boys and girls of the town, at our swimming hole in a bend of the Murray River, and he was as popular among the youth as he was among the adults. Bob never really swam. He would simply bob in and out of the water, disappearing below the surface for up to 2 minutes, and some people said that was how he got his name Bob. He loved to disappear like that, and no matter where we watched for him to reappear, his smiling black face would bob up from some unlikely spot. How do you do it, Bob? We always wanted to know. How do you stay under so long? I just take a deep breath, Bob would say simply. In fact, I know now that Bob would use a technique developed by expert snorkelers many years later. He would expel every ounce of air from his lungs with a dozen quick breaths, thus venting out all the carbon dioxide, and then he would take one big pure breath and simply disappear, using as little effort as possible while underwater. Bob also knew when and where the best places were to catch fish, and if he took his advice and fished at a certain spot, he would often squat beside you and simply wait, saying nothing until you caught a fish. Then he would give a little grunt and say, "Two more there somewhere," and more often than not, he was right. You would catch two more fish, and that was that. I suppose the real story begins with Bob's brother, or rather, someone we thought of as his brother, although we didn't know for sure. We called him, in our Australian passion for the echoic, Job. And Job was as different from Bob as Bob was from us. Though everybody in town knew Bob and talked to him, nobody really knew Job, and nobody in town ever talked to him. He never came into town. Job lived across the river on Pentel Island, and the view most of us had of Job was a rather typical one, not of the civilized aborigine like Bob, but of the native in his habitat. Sometimes when we were swimming in the river, Job would stand on the bank farther down watching us. He would stand the way the aborigines stood in the bush, with one bare foot drawn up to rest against the side of the other leg, so that he looked like a stork standing on one leg. What do you got, bruv? There's Job, someone would shout. Mostly we ignored him, but if some of the boys felt like a little fun, they would begin to call out to him. Well, what do you think happened to Job? No, I think I skipped the page. We would call out to him, "Come on, Job, come and show us how you walk on one leg." Job was reported to live in a willowaw, a leaf hut, in a patch of bush on the island across the river, and he hunted for his food with a spear, club, and boomerang, although nobody ever saw him doing it. But we knew he did it because there was no other way he could survive. He lives like a fox, we would tell each other, and like a fox he would disappear the moment you approached him. We had given up making a sport of trying to catch him when he watched us from the riverbank. He could outrun all of us. He was over 6 feet tall, was very thin, and wore nothing more than a pair of torn cotton trousers, summer and winter. But he never uttered a word. Sometimes, when we went across the river to the brush where he lived, we would hunt for Job, trying to catch him unaware, but though we hunted every day for his willowaw, we never found it. And if we ever did chase him, it was because he showed himself and seemed to invite it. But again, we could never catch him. He would simply disappear before our eyes. He lives in the trees, we said. No, it's a big hole in the ground like a rabbit. He's got an underwater cave and just dives in. Fake pre-recorded. I wouldn't shout you out for 500. I mean, I guess I would for 500,000. He's got an underwater cave and just dives in. In fact, the only person who had any real contact with him was Bob, who would sometimes swim the river and join Job, and they would walk off together into the bush, not side by side, but with Bob 10 yards behind, as if that was as near as he was allowed. Often Job would rush at Bob as if he was going to spear him, or he would dance around Bob and threaten him with a boomerang. Once I saw him hit Bob very hard with the side of his spear, but no matter what Job did, Bob would never retaliate. He would wait patiently for the threats to pass and then follow Job into the brush. I never heard it myself, but plenty of people in the town had heard shouting and screaming from the bush on moonlit nights, and they always said it was Bob beating up Job, or Job beating up Bob. Nobody knew which it was. Sometimes Bob took a sugar bag of food. What the hell's a sugar bag? Bob took a sugar bag of food. We assumed it was food with him, and in the winter, when the river was too high and fast to swim, Bob would ride the long way around by the bridge and stay with Job for a couple of days and then return. But there was one thing that Bob wouldn't tolerate. If we asked him any questions about his brother Job, he became furious. Mind your own bloody business, he would say fiercely, which seemed quite out of character. Once or twice, when some of the boys teased him about Job, singing a crude rhyme which went Job, Job, blue, blah, blah, Bob again changed character and lashed the boys with his bullwhip, cutting one of them severely on the leg. He chased the boys when they ran away in terror, swearing at them and threatening death if they ever did that again. He went crazy, Jack Johnson, one of the boys said. He kept shouting at us, don't even talk to me. Don't say anything. Bob was equally fierce with any adult who inquired about Job, and when two ladies from a local Baptist organization took a bundle of clothes to Bob for his brother, Bob threw a spadeful of horse manure at them and shouted, "Leave me alone," and chased them down the street. So the town learned not to mention the subject of his brother, and then general consensus was that Bob was embarrassed and resentful because his brother was a little touched. In fact, anybody who had seen Job knew that he was crazy. That was how it remained until the next summer when Job disappeared, or rather, he was not seen anymore. At first, we didn't notice Job's absence when we began our summer pleasures in the swimming hole. But then someone commented on it, and we began to miss that stork-like figure watching us at play. Somebody ought to ask Bob what's happened to him, Clive Sandiford. Is that what this is? Sandiford? Suggested. Don't be stupid, one of the girls said. Bob use his whip on you. Bobda. Well, what do you think's happened to Job? We didn't know. Job didn't show himself when we went into his patch of bush, and Bob no longer swam the river with a sugar bag full of food. It was obvious that Job had gone. But where to? It took a little while for Job's disappearance to penetrate the rest of the town, but when it did, there was sufficient interest in the fate of Job for the police to begin to ask questions. And at this point, the real problem began. When Sergeant Joe Collins of the local police called on Bob to ask him what happened to his brother, Bob became indignant. What brother? He said. I haven't got a brother. Well, whoever he was, Sergeant Collins said, that black feller across the river on Pentel Island. There wasn't any black feller across the river on Pentel Island, Bob said. I don't know what you're talking about. Not a thing. Come off it, Bob. Everybody knows you had some mate or brother or relative or on the over the other side of the river. So what's happened to him? Happened to who? Bob said stubbornly. I didn't know anybody across the river. I never saw anybody over there. So what are you talking about? Bob was adamant. There was nobody across the river. There never had been. There was no Job or Job. Job had never There was no Job. Job had never existed. The curious thing is that if Bob had simply said that Job had gone away or fallen into the river and drowned, the police would probably have believed him and left it at that. But when Bob firmly refused to admit that there ever had been another man, whether it was his brother or not, the police became suspicious. One Saturday morning, 3 policemen were seen scouring the bush on Pentel Island, and a few days later, Bob was taken to the police station and asked more questions. Nobody over there, Bob insisted again. Never was, I tell you. It was too much, and when Bob finally became angry and shouted and insulted the police and denied again Job's existence, and he was charged and locked up in the local jail while the police went on searching for the body. The police decided that Bob had murdered his brother, and he was charged and locked up in the local jail while the police went on searching for the body. I suppose it was a ridiculous charge from the outset, and if Bob had been a white man, the police would probably have thought twice before charging him. But Bob was a black feller, and everybody knew that black fellers didn't think the way we did, or accept the same rules of behavior as the rest of the community. Aborigines in the Northern Territory were always being charged with curious, casual murders, so it was an easy sort of Australian callousness that assumed Bob to have murdered the mysterious Job. What else would explain his curious and ridiculous pretense that Job had never existed at all? It didn't take long for the magistrate to commit Bob for trial, and already the town was divided about his guilt or innocence. A lot of people thought it very funny. Others were sure that Bob had killed Job with an axe, a spear, a boomerang. A rumor went around town that Job's body had been found farther down the river, horribly mutilated, but it proved untrue, and a dozen other rumors also came to nothing. There was still no body to prove the point conclusively when Gil Sullivan called at our house one night and asked my father to defend Bob. "I'll pay your fee, Mr. Quayle," Gil said. "I'm selling a thoroughbred next week, and I'll have some cash. I know Bob, and I know he wouldn't murder anybody." "Then why on earth does he deny the existence of his brother?" my father asked, since, like the rest of the town, he knew the story. "I don't know, Mr. Quayle," Gil said. "I just don't know." "Have you asked him why he insists there wasn't anybody across the river when everybody has known for years that there was?" "He won't talk about it. He just refuses." "If he won't talk about it, how can I defend him?" my father said. "I don't know that either," Gil said. "It's pretty hopeless." Gil had unwittingly said the right thing. He had given my father a challenge. "All right," my father said. "I'll look into it and let you know." My father's method of looking into a case was to search for its inner logic. There had to be sense in defense. And though the prosecution case had very little sense in it, Bob's situation was bad so long as he insisted there never had been another man across the river. It was tantamount to a childish Aborigine way of trying to hide his guilt. That was the argument, anyway. My father talked to Bob, and he told me many years later that all he could do was to point out to Bob that by remaining silent he was risking his life, because he could very easily be found guilty by a local jury and murder then was punished by hanging. But Bob still refused to say or do anything that would admit the existence of Job. So it was obviously something very powerful that was at work on Bob, my father said, and because this seemed to be the clue to the inner logic of the case, he set about finding out what it was. My father had a good library, and I saw him consulting some anthropological books on Aborigines. There was also one other Aborigine in our town, or rather, she would appear in the town from time to time selling colorful crown-like headpieces made of pink cockatoo feathers. She was Queen Aggie, and she lived as a guest on the Riverside Station on the New South Wales side of the Murray, occasionally walking 8 miles into town to sit on the post office corner selling her beautifully made headpieces. I knew that my father had long talks with Aggie because one day I saw him talking to her on the street corner, and another time she came to our house and squatted under the walnut tree and talked to my father for half an hour. A day or two my father spent eating silently, staring determinedly ahead, walking unseen to his office, and then he told Gil Sullivan he would take the case. He had obviously found the inner logic of the case, although he didn't tell us what it was. He would save that for the court. In fact, the case itself was little more than a straightforward argument between two advocates, one for the prosecution and one for the defense. There was no real evidence, and the premise of the prosecution was an inexplicable disappearance which could only be explained by one man doing away with another. That was the case made out by the plump J.C. Strap for the prosecution. The facts were well known, he said. He could produce 50 witnesses to prove that there had been another Aborigine living across the river and that Bob had been seen with him year after year, and that this other Aborigine, known to the town as Job, was sometimes seen to threaten Bob. Crying and shouting had been heard across the river time and time again, evidence of quarrels and fights over many years between the two men. A corpus delicti, a body, isn't necessary to justify a charge of murder, Strap said, waving his plump fingers at my father, so I hope the defense will not waste time on that aspect of the case. There are too many precedents in English law to have the case thrown out for lack of a body. The real point is that the defendant has tried to hide his guilt by pretending there was never another man, which is not only ridiculous, but is obviously the device of a very naive and primitive mind trying to deny one fact, murder, by denying another fact, the existence of the man he did to death. Only a simple mind would defend himself in this way, and it is well known that the Aborigines in general have very simple minds, and that death is often an easy solution to their tribal and personal quarrels, which doesn't make the crime any less under our law. All that the accused has to do is to deny what he is accused of and explain what has happened to his brother or whoever that other man was. That's all that it is asked of him, but that is what he refuses to do. A damning piece of evidence by itself. Strap went on generalizing while Bob sat in the box, staring ahead, refusing to listen to any of it. When Strap had finished his argument, my father waited some time before beginning his defense. He knew very well that everybody in that court except Bob was curious to know what his argument would be. There were one or two obvious alternatives. He could ask the jury to bring in a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder, since malice aforethought or even the motive was absent. Or he could easily have argued the shallowness of the prosecution's case, the lack of evidence or proof of any kind. He was a clever advocate, and he could easily have made an excellent case of either argument. But they were too easy for my father. Moreover, both arguments failed to satisfy the internal sense he insisted on. The point at issue in this case, he began when he had allowed his hesitation to take effect, is whether or not another man actually lived across the river. The man Bob is supposed to have killed. Well, it is my intention to prove that there was never another man, that he never existed at all, so that Bob could not have killed him. There was a moment's silence, then the whole courtroom burst into laughter, including J.C. Strapp, the police, and as far as he would allow himself, the judge, Campbell, L.C. My father was used to being laughed at in court. In fact, he would deliberately provoke it whenever he anticipated having the last laugh himself. He waited patiently for the laughter to subside, and he ignored J.C. Strapp's sotto voce remark. Now he's going to play Houdini. Then he began his defense. The word aborigine, he said in the instructive sort of voice he often used annoyingly to juries, is a Greek word which means a native of a place, a true indigene, a person who has the right to call a locale his own. Now, gentlemen, with this definition in mind, you will note that we, sitting white and pure in this courtroom, do not call ourselves the Aborigines of Australia. Oh no, we would never do that. Instead, we use that word sometimes as an insult for black men like Bob. Black men who had been here on this very spot for millennia before we ever arrived. He paused again, as if waiting for that much to sink in, as if waiting for the rhythm of his argument to take hold. So what you have to consider when you look at Bob's behavior, he went on, is that he is the true native of this place and belongs to a totally different culture from the one which brought us here. No matter what way you look at it, we are the strangers here, and we have no right to forget it. In other words, this is really Bob's country. My father raised one of his short, stubby fingers and pointed casually in Bob's direction so that everybody looked at the black figure in the Jodhpurs, 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 sitting behind the wooden barrier with his fingers entwined across his chest. I suppose everybody in that courtroom expected Bob to show some response or interest, but Bob remained impassive and uninterested in anything that was going on, and the judge noticed it. I don't know if you are trying to impress your client or the court, Mr. Quayle, he said, but I hope there is some relevance to this little history lesson we are getting. There is, my lord, my father said, and if I may point out, it isn't a history lesson. I am simply stating a fact which lies at the root of this case. Very well, but please get to the point so that we know why we have to listen to all this. The point will soon become obvious, my lord, my father said, rather irritably, as if he had had enough of this interruption. In fact, the point I want to make here is that the culture and religion and beliefs of Bob and his people explain what this case is all about. Really, my lord, I must protest, Strapp began. Oh, let him finish, Mr. Strapp, the judge said. We may actually learn something about Australia from Mr. Quayle, even if he isn't relevant. And I feel like learning something today, so proceed. Thank you, my lord, my father said, and I hope you do learn. I hope you do learn something today, because if the police, not the policies, or the prosecution had taken the trouble to look into the reasons for Bob's behavior, they would never have brought this case to trial in the first place. Then do get on with it, Mr. Quail. It's really very simple, my father said, and for the first time directly addressed the jury. You see, gentlemen, all Aborigine culture is ghost ridden. They believe that everything has a spirit, even a tree, and that man himself is no more than the spirit of those who have gone before him. As a result, there are 10,000 ghosts all around all Aborigines at all times. In the air, the grass, the river, the trees, the animals, the men, the women. What is real and what is ghostly is often very difficult to separate, and often there is serious confusion. But there is one ghost that all Aborigines are sure is a ghost, or a spirit, if you like, and that is anyone who is touched in the head, or is epileptic or mad. If the prosecution had taken the trouble to investigate, they would have discovered that mad people do not really exist for the normal Aborigine. They are treated as spirits. It is taboo to talk to them, talk about them, touch them, or even look at them. If you destroy those taboos, you can be stricken yourself with the same misfortune and turned into a ghost in an instant. Such people are left to fend for themselves, although, like the Chinese who put rice bowls on the graves of the dead, it is permissible to leave food for the ghost if you wish. In fact, it is considered an act of self protection and propitiation, or propitiation. By now, the courtroom was genuinely interested, even fascinated, and my father paused here to let his revelations have their effect. Now it is obvious what has happened in Bob's case, he went on. Bob was dealing with the ghosts across the river, not a man. That is why he always became furious when anyone asked him questions or tried to help. It was taboo for Bob even to talk about the one we call Job. It is quite true that there were very odd sounds heard across the river on some nights when the moon was full, but this was ritual chanting and propitiation, not quarreling. It was Bob appealing to his totem for protection. Hello, Bobs. Finally, gentlemen, when one of these ghosts departs, he doesn't die in the real sense. He simply replaces himself with a tree or a fox or something unknown. It is then absolutely vital that the ghost, the dead body if you like, is hidden so well that nobody can find it, and no trace is left of any kind, nor can it ever be mentioned or talked about. If this taboo is broken, it can mean death. Again my father interrupted himself, shuffling some papers, pushing his hands into his hip pockets and looking at the ceiling. He knew what he was doing because there wasn't a sound in that courtroom. He went on looking at the ceiling, even as he addressed the jury. So you can see, gentlemen, why I am asking you to accept the truth of Bob's belief that nobody lived across the river, that he had no brother, never saw anybody over there, and cannot explain or deny any accusations about him. He could never have killed the ghost because the taboos in Bob's culture about touching or hurting ghosts are even stronger in Bob's eyes than murder is in ours. So, gentlemen, I ask you to judge this case by the laws and beliefs of the true natives of this country and accept the fact that there never was anybody across the river, and that Bob was telling the truth when he denied all knowledge of anything that happened across the river. Because nothing happened, nothing at all. A ghost simply departed. And that is the truth of the matter. Again, there was silence, but what was more important, nobody laughed. In fact, it took the jury no more than 15 minutes to reach their verdict, and it is anyone's guess why they did reach their verdict. Was it my father's advocacy that convinced them, Was it their instinct for natural justice, or was it the inexplicable Australian sense of humor which persuaded them to declare Bob not guilty? Most likely it was the latter. In any case, my father was sure of the verdict before it came in because he knew his countrymen very well, however English he thought he was. In the years that passed, my father considered the case to be one of those that were hardly worth remembering. It had been too easy, but the town was left with its curious legacy. A few weeks after the case was over, a blacksmith named Peter Wallace was fishing one moonlit night in the patch of bush across the river, and he came back in a panic to his wife and neighbors, swearing that he had seen a ghost over there, the ghost of Job, the blackfeller. The town took it in good spirit, and it was something of a joke at first, but a few months later, two schoolboys camping by the river said they had seen a black man, a ghostly figure in war paint, running along the riverbank. Then the ghost moved into town, and Job was seen by two teenage girls coming home late one night from a party. He had floated, they said, from a big peppercorn tree in a dark corner of the town. He was seen again dancing madly by an old woman who lived alone in a tumble-down shack by the railroad station. And as the years passed, Job was seen regularly once or twice a year by someone or other until he became known as an old familiar, as the highly reputable ghost of St. Helen. But one thing always puzzled me. About 10 years ago, I asked my father exactly who had told him about madmen being ghosts, taboo to touch or recognition in Aborigine beliefs. Well, he said, I knew that all Aboriginal culture was ghost ridden. That's a fact, and old Queen Aggie confirmed it. I also knew that Job was probably mad, so it seemed logical that Bob's behavior was based on a taboo of ghosts and madness of some sort. But you didn't really know. Nonetheless, it was the only explanation because it made sense. It was the inner logic of the case. So my father had really invented the whole story of the ghostly taboo, however logical he said it was. What threw further doubt on it for me was the fact that a couple of weeks after the case, Bob turned up at our back door one night with a spear and a throwing stick and a boomerang. He said, these are for you, Mr. Quail, and left without saying anything more. I knew they were Job's, and I knew that if my father's story had been true, Bob would have buried the weapons with the ghost, since they were sure to be as taboo as Job himself. Those old weapons hung in our hall for many years, and I don't know what happened to Bob. And I don't know what happened to them, pardon. I don't even know what eventually happened to Bob. In fact, the only memory that remains to this day is the memory of Job himself, the black ghost of St. Helen, who will go on haunting the town long after the rest of us are dead and buried and ghostless in our graves. And that's the end of that story. Let me block this son of a bitch who ever offered me $5, which he didn't mean. Ever offer me $5 again. You son of a bitch.